nature provides, I think, is the maxim that I like to use. Like if you're looking for something, almost always you're going to find the solution in the problem somewhere, right? Because that's kind of how nature operates.
Correct.
Let's go.
Welcome to Citizen. We've got a special guest today for the second time, Jack Spirko of the Survival Podcast. How's it going?
Hey, man, thanks for having me back. I really enjoy being here with you.
For sure. You were just telling me before we got started here that a lot of our fans have reached out to talk about, I guess, an increased motif on this show, which is, I guess preparedness. People think of preparedness in a lot of different ways, but, I think it is, and this is the case with any situation you might be in, but reduce it down to the fucking core elements, right? What does it mean? So people are worried about resources always. Resource scarcity is always a situation for people. And a lot of people think about divesting their portfolio, having money in gold or crypto or whatever else. I'm like, all right, cool. That you've gone one step further down the line, which is good, but you need to go all the way down the line. What is it that those things can purchase? You know what I mean? That's what you should really be focused on. And the things that you want to be able to purchase are security, energy, and food, right? In whatever form that comes. Security in the form of walls or around your house, or a gate around your property, or a fence around your property, and then the other two are pretty obvious. So this is something you've kind of made a career out of.
Yeah, and I mean, like, just evaluating that from a preparedness standpoint, if you think about wilderness survival training, for instance, they're going to teach you 5 primary survival needs: food, water, shelter, right, fire, and security. And the one they'll leave out, because it's not that big of a deal if you're lost in the woods, is health and sanitation. You take a deuce, you kick some dirt over it, and you're good. But if you're in a suburban environment, or even in a rural environment where you have lots of people around, we have to add that one. So those are kind of the 6 things that I focused on. But the one that I think has most people concerned right now, I guess it's really split between 2. One is security, and the other is food. I think most people realize that unless you live in the middle of the desert, we can skin water pretty easily. You can store as much as you want now essentially for free. It's not a difficult thing to do to make sure that you have your water needs taken care of. But if somebody comes and hurts you or your family, you've got a problem. We can talk all we want about self-defense and whatever, and I think it's a very important topic. But in the end, if you are a upstanding citizen, you're not walking around constantly with, you're not at low draw walking around all the time, and anybody could come into a situation like that and do you harm. So security is something people are really worried about. And then, we always, the cliches usually have an anchor in reality, and I have to put food on the table and keep a roof overhead. There's a reason that's a cliche. And the food supply in particular is something that people seem very concerned about right now, and they should be, because what's there is precarious and in many ways toxic at the same time. So now you're feeding your family food that you worked really hard for, but a lot of it is probably not even fit for human consumption. And I think those are kind of the 2 big areas that people are most concerned about right now.
Yeah, if you're shopping in the middle aisles of the grocery store, none of that shit is fit for human consumption, frankly. And to be honest, the bioavailability of our fruits and vegetables and the meat that you buy from grocery stores and shit like that is highly suspect as well. Now, as far as meat goes, in Texas, we're better off than most states, I would say, for beef. But for pork, not so much, at least in my opinion, right? So if you go to the grocery store and the fat on the meat looks a little too white, that's not real. That's corn. That's bullshit, right? There's no nutrients in that. Like, the purpose of eating animal fat is that they're ruminant. The ones that we typically eat are ruminant, and they can store nutrients in their fat that we can't process otherwise, right? So it's already processed. It's already in a lipid carrier. It's right there for the taking. It's kind of almost like it was fucking made this way. You know what I mean?
It's almost like it was supposed to be food for us. I mean, one of the really telling things is just, get a really good quality organic butter and get a really good quality grass-fed butter and put them side by side. And even though one's organic, it's also probably grain-fed dairy cattle, and it'll be white and then your grass-fed butter will be very, very yellow, and those are those omega fatty acids in there that we so need in our lives to get that omega-3, omega-6 balance. And it's completely out of whack. Even when somebody is taking the step of feeding their cattle feed where they know they're not being fed glyphosate or other pests or herbicides or something like that, it's not what we evolved to consume, and it's very degrading as far as a land practice. You think about what does a cow want to eat? A cow wants to eat grass. You said it yours perfectly. They're a ruminant, so they ruminate on grass. And what happens when they eat grass? Well, they poop on the grass that they ate, and then it grows back, and then we never disturb the soil, and it just keeps going perpetually forever. Like ruminants are supposed to maintain, plain grass savanna type ecosystems or something like crazy like that. That like nature evolved that way, and we evolved eating those animals. I know that sounds insane to some people, but there was life before modern factory farming.
Isn't it like, I mean, we do a lot of really stupid shit and a lot of arrogant, egocentric shit as human beings, but thinking you can outsmart nature has got to be right at the top of that fucking list. I mean,
Yeah.
my God, the arrogance of someone to look at what's worked more or less for what, let's say in this current iteration of our DNA, 180,000 years, but for
Sure.
for bipedal mammals, 3 million years. Who fucking knows how long, really? But yeah, we've been doing the same shit for a very long time. It's like, all right, maybe there's something to that, or even if there wasn't something purposeful behind that, we've certainly gotten used to it by now, right?
Yeah. Well, what we need to do is really focus on what's called biomimicry, which means when you're trying to figure something out, look first and see how nature does it. Now, this can be taken on very quickly by certain people who oversimplify things. Generally, that would be the left, being more emotionally than logically led, and they'll just say, "Well, you don't have to do anything at all; just let nature do it." And all that makes me think of, remember Chop in was it Washington, where they took over
Oh
like
yeah,
a
Chaz,
part
Chop,
downtown.
yeah.
And the hippies, they went out and they got like 40 bags of topsoil and a bunch of cardboard, and they just threw it on the ground and threw the topsoil, and it kicked it around and took some box store plants and stuck them in there. And like half an hour later, they're sitting there with their hands on their head, like freaked out, wondering why all the plants are already dying. Like, you can't just leave it to nature when we broke it. Think about it this way, dude. Imagine we took a place and we scraped off a foot of everything. We just wiped out like an acre, a foot deep, and took all the topsoil away. And we said, well, nature will fix it, and we didn't do anything to help it restore. It may eventually restore, but wouldn't it be great if we could figure out what we did wrong and put things back the way we were? And with soils, which is where this all, I don't care if you're eating a vegetarian diet, a vegan diet, a highly carnivore diet, the way I do, whatever, it still always goes back to soil, because you're either eating something that grew in the soil, or you're eating something that grew, or they ate something that grew in the soil, one way or the other. And if you look at what we're doing today, if we ask what else do we do with the same technology, we start to realize how flawed what we're doing is. So here's an example. What do you think the first thing they do when they're going to put a new road in is, as far as getting the ground ready to put a road on top of it?
They probably scrape off the top couple of feet, I would imagine.
They do that. They'll scrape it. They'll grade it. They'll get it the way they want. But then the very next thing they do is they bring the same equipment in a farmer uses. They bring in a disc plow, and they plow the entire road base, because what it'll do is it'll stir up the biology in the soil, and it'll release something called R. strategidus bacterium. And that's a reproductive, R is for reproduction, and they reproduce very, very rapidly. And what they do is consume organic matter. So if you're putting a road on top of the ground, you don't want settle. So you don't want anything alive underneath it. You want to kill all life, because if you have organic matter down there and it decomposes, the road will settle. So the very technology that the Highway Commission will use to make a road base to the point where it will not settle is the same thing we're telling farmers to do to aerate the soil. And if you've ever looked at a plowed field, it looks great when you do it, right? It's all turned up and everything looks good. But it doesn't take very long until all of that soil just starts compacting down. And the reason is you've killed the biology. And whatever organic matter was in that soil from like the last crop, once you heat up that R. strategidus bacteria, you've just completely decimated it. It will actually consume whatever is there. we should have somewhere around 2 to 3% organic matter in about any soil that we're farming. Most of the farms in America, and this includes no-till, it includes organic, it includes just about everything except intentionally naturally farmed systems, is under 1%. And kind of the doing nothing approach before we got here and started plowing stuff was about 3 on average of any kind of basic agriculture that the Native Americans were doing was around 3%. And the prairie ecosystems were up in the neighborhood of 6%.
So this is a problem of scale then, right? Because you can't, if you're going to be fair to large farms, the process they go through might make sense for mass scale factory farming, but we know and I mean just to be able to the ease of planting the vegetable or fruit, right?
Yep.
For example, not necessarily the quality, but it is always the case that when you sacrifice, when something gets more convenient, you lose something else, right? That's how nature always works. It's how evolution works. There's only so much energy available, and if you use some for one thing, you're taking it away from something else. And it's why today I weigh 220 pounds. I have to eat 28 servings of green vegetables a day to get the amount of nutrients out of green vegetables that I'm supposed to get. That's what I'm told, right? Now that number was quite a bit lower 100 years ago, obviously, right? The bioavailability. So it's not just about people think of factory farming and then they see organic as a solution to it, something you alluded to before. They're like, oh, well, at least it's not poisonous. At least it doesn't have Roundup on it, for example, which is poison.
Yeah.
But not just poison, but also fucks up your hormones. But it isn't just about that. It's also about nutrient bioavailability. Whether this stuff actually has the nutrients in it that it's supposed to. And if you're buying vegetables and shit from a factory farm, it just doesn't, right? It doesn't have it's not the same quality.
It's not going to, and it can't without the biology restored to the soil, because this is the process whereby the plant's actually able to take up the macro and micronutrients in that profile that you're talking about. And again, this affects you even if you are a carnivore or heavily ketovore and you're eating mostly a meat and fat-based diet, because whatever you're eating, what is it eating? Where is it getting its nutrient profile? And you just can't get the nutrient into the plant without the biology at any significant level. So here's an example for you. One of the most expensive nutrients that farmers buy is phosphorus. It's number 2 versus nitrogen. And I'm not talking about the sides, right? The herbicides, the pesticides. When it comes to just fertility that farmers put down, number 1 is nitrogen, number 2 is phosphorus. But let me ask you this. How much phosphorus, measured in years, do you think there is in the average farmer's field, even though they're going to put more phosphorus on it this year?
How many years do I think?
Yeah, like how like if you said how much the plants need every year, how many years could that farm go if the plant could actually get to the phosphorus in the field?
If it could actually get to it, probably 20 years, I would guess.
It's about half right. It's 40 years.
Oh wow, damn, that's a long time. So why can't it get to it then? What's stopping it from getting to it? That's the question.
So we get everything wrong when we analyze this. If you talk to people, and I mean smart people, I'm not picking on them. They know what they've been taught. We are taught that a plant is simply like a sponge, that it has roots in the soil, and then water basically acts as this universal solvent, and the phosphorus, the nitrogen, the potassium, the manganese, the copper, the selenium, everything is just there, and it just sucks it up. Well, this is not how that works. It can't function that way. And the only way you can get it to take some of what it needs is to put so much in front of it that it's going to get something, right? So that's what they do, is they just keep throwing more and more phosphorus on the field. When you increase the biology, the plant now is able, through symbiotic and honestly carnivorous relationships. So for all the vegans out there, your plants are eating microbes. I mean, they literally, like, we used to think that this entire relationship was symbiotic, that these bacteria would feed on the exudate from the plant, which is the oozing that comes out of the plant roots, and that would attract the bacteria, and then the bacteria would poop and the plant would suck that up. We've literally figured out in the last few years that the plants are vacuuming up these microbes.
Yeah,
like
which that's really
sucking them up.
That's really got to piss off the Jain Buddhists, because they're the extremist versions of Buddhists.
Yeah.
And they wear a
Yeah.
cheesecloth over their mouth to make sure they don't accidentally eat anything that was a living creature at some point. Like, sorry, bud, your food was eating living creatures. I don't know what to tell you.
Every life form consumes some other life form, one way or another, either before or after death, right? So your other side of this now is the fungi in the soil as well. And these mycorrhizal fungi, what they do in that soil profile is they actually attach to the roots of the plant, and in effect, they extend the roots of the plant far further than that plant could reach. They form these highways. Think of them like rivers and canals. Basically, you've got the hyphae of the fungi, but what will happen is water will form like an envelope around it. So the fungi can transport nutrient back and forth. It will take from the plant and give to the plant. And the fungi do have this symbiotic relationship. But just like any strand, like if you take a string and on a glass, you can pour water from one glass to another across the string, a little science experiment from like fifth grade. Well, that water will do that same thing through surface tension and form around all of these hyphae in the soil. And the bacteria, and I'm talking about beneficial bacteria here that actually benefit the plant, benefit the soil profile. They'll use those like highways. They'll like if you look under a microscope, you'll see them literally swimming up and down these channels that form around the hyphae. So if you think about the hyphae, this is a very fine hair-like structure, and there'll be miles and miles of hyphae in healthy soil, a tablespoon, because of the way surface area works. We're talking about the microscopic here. Now, you've got this incredibly fine network, and we come through there with a plow. What do? We just tear it apart, right? You were in the military. Think about how you felt that time you came back from a day of training in basic, and one of your mates screwed up and left something wrong, and the drill sergeants took all of everybody's stuff, and they threw it out in the common area, and like beds are upside down. Like that's what you've done to the soil biology. You've torn it all apart. And now, by the time it starts to come back together in the next season, what do? We tear it apart again. And if these networks are how we move materials, right, then how can the plant possibly move that material from the soil into its body? What do we do in a war? And I'm not talking about these limited police action bullshit things that we do. Like, we're talking nation on nation, like World War II, one trying to just completely beat the other one into submission. What is the first thing you attack?
Supply lines, yes.
Bridges and roads and communications lines.
Yep.
And if you significantly take out all of that infrastructure, the enemy the only thing the enemy has left then is like guerrilla warfare. They can't move materials around. They can't resupply their troops. We have gone to war with the soil. And maybe that'll put it into context that makes a lot of sense to your listener base. We've gone to war with the soil, and this should be our greatest ally, right? This is the thing that's kept us alive. I can't remember who said it, but somebody said something very famously one time along the lines of, we owe all life on Earth to a few inches of topsoil and the fact that it rains. And that's not an overstatement. Like, you can't survive without that. Why can't we just go to Mars and start, living Elon's dream, right? There's a lot of fantasy built around that whole idea. But it doesn't rain and there isn't any soil, so you have to artificially create everything.
Right.
We don't have Star Trek's replicators yet. I love watching that stuff go on. I want to see us explore space, but we're not going to have people living on Mars long term anytime soon because we don't have those two things.
But it does seem like you could develop the technology to inject these fungal lines into the soil, right? Maybe it would take time to rebuild it, right? But there should be, like, in the same way we talked about it the last time you were here, about, let's say, over nitrogenating your permafrost just to get it to grow to scale more quickly. You would think, because fungal growth is like a little bit of moisture and a little bit of heat, and those things will take off, right? So I feel like there might be. By the way, that was Paul Harvey that said that. He said, despite all our accomplishments, we owe our existence to a 6-inch layer of topsoil and the fact that it rains. So
we can go really fast with this, though.
Yeah.
Like, this doesn't have to take a long time. So one of the things I've done since the last time I was on, I have a new website that we're doing online education through called Home Food Systems, homefoodsystems.com. And the first course that we put out is on what's called bioreactor composting. And unlike a typical compost where you're constantly turning it, it actually takes a year to finish a batch. And it's a form of indigenous microorganism capture. We're partnering with soil organisms and worms and fungi, et cetera, when we build this. But an application rate for this type of compost is about 400 pounds to the acre. Now, I want you to think about that. 400 pounds to an acre. So a acre, for people to get in their head, if you're not just familiar with what an acre looks like, is pretty much a football field, including the end zones. That's right at an acre. 400 pounds would be a big pile in a wheelbarrow. So imagine spreading a wheelbarrow's worth of compost across an entire football field. And it's a dusting, you can't even see it. And it can turn that ecosystem around. Now, there's other things we can and should be doing here, and including things we stop doing, like tilling the soil. But that can turn on the biology in the soil in a single application. And we can go even, we don't even need anywhere that much. If we're using something like an extract, which is basically we soak the compost in water and then we spray that water, we're looking at more like 10 pounds to the acre.
10 pounds?
10 pounds to the acre, because it's not, see, everybody wants, like, how do we replace the 4-4-4 or 10-10-10 NPK ratio fertilizer? It's not about that, right? It's about the biology. It's about, if we restore the life in the soil, most of what the plant needs, it can get, honestly, out of thin air. If you take a plant, about 95% of its weight is water. What's left, about 80 to 90% of it, is carbon, oxygen, and nitrogen. Where does that come from? It comes from the air. You're breathing it right now. You're breathing it right now. So
yeah, what are we, 78% nitrogen, I think?
78% of our atmosphere, despite all the global warming alarmism, the CO2 is like 0.38%.
Yeah.
It's less than 0.4%. So it's not even a 0.5%, but it's 78% nitrogen.
Mm-hmm.
Now, let me say where I actually agree with the global warming freaks. There is not, or there is too much carbon in the atmosphere, but not for the reasoning that they have. What did I say at the beginning? How much is supposed to be in the soil? 2 to 4% minimum, and there's less than 1. So if we're going to get it into the soil, where does it have to come from? I think this is another thing. Like we fail our youth with basic science, like Science 101. There isn't going to be any more carbon on this planet than there is right now. Carbon is an element high enough in the periodic table, it gets manufactured in stars. So unless we start building some sort of fusion reactors or something, the carbon we have is the carbon we have. All it changes is the allocation and the assortment and the assemblage. So when a plant grows, all the carbon that ends up in that plant comes out of the atmosphere or out of the soil into that plant. And then when it dies and decomposes, it's re-released into the soil and back into the atmosphere.
So
that's our basic carbon cycle, right?
So why isn't enough or more carbon making its way from the clouds back to the earth then, I guess, if that's the right way to put it?
So again, we're back to biology. So for that plant to function and do its job and act like what it is, which is a solar panel that takes carbon out of the atmosphere, produces sugars for the plants, and puts carbon into the root system and thereby the soil, it has to have that biology. What's really interesting, though, is like if you go to NASA, you can find a video, and I can send it to you after we're done with this if you want to make it available to your listeners, where they show the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. And in February, where not much is growing yet, it's still pretty low. And then right about March into April, the amount of CO2 in our atmosphere in the northern hemisphere explodes. And then by June, it goes way back down again. Now, you would think summers, when everybody's traveling, there's more jets in the air, there's more people on the road, kids are out of school, that, since man makes it all, that's where it should be high. What do we do in March and April? We disc and we plow fields. And what plants are alive in those fields get murdered. We release all that CO2 that was from the, whatever organic matter we did get into the soil from that cycle gets released into the atmosphere, and now the soil's dead. So now we go and we put corn or wheat or beans or whatever in the soil, and we dump a bunch of chemicals on to get it to grow. And that plant will grow, but basically what we've done, we've taken a 40,000 acre field of soil and we've turned it into like an analog for hydroponics. Now, if you're on the Starship Enterprise, growing with hydroponics makes sense. If you're a prepper and you want to grow salad through your winter and in your house, I don't hate hydroponics. But we don't need to be turning 40,000 acres squares of soil into a point where we only look at the soil as a growing medium. Like, soil has purposes, and growing medium is only one of them. The soil food web is where all of this ability for the plant to get that material into itself, and again, to bring that carbon out of the atmosphere and into the soil. And it doesn't need to be there forever. It's called a cycle. It should move in and out, basically like a form of respiration is how our healthy ecosystem should work. And the way to do that is to keep the soil covered is at all times if possible. Integrate animals into the system. And you were kind of alluding to this earlier that like in defensive factory farms, like they have to produce enough food for 8 billion people or what have you. We don't need to do what they're doing to feed the planet. We can do what we're talking about at sale. There's farmers doing it and they're making more, not less money. Because let's say I take you and you were producing 130 bushels of corn, but you were eating up 70 bushels of production in input expenses. But now I cut you down to where you're producing 120 bushels of corn, but your input expenses now represent 10 bushels. Which one do you make more money in?
Yeah.
Right? It's not how much you make, it's how much you keep. So we can do this. The key, though, is one, put an armor on the soil, keep it covered at all times, and integrate animals into the system.
When you say keep the soil covered, what do you mean by that?
I mean, keep it covered. Like we do not need to be plowing. And
I see what you mean. You mean like leave it alone and not turn the soil over is what you're saying.
Let's not turn the soil over. So like a basic way that we run a cover crop is we'll plant a cover crop. Let's say a winter cover crop of something like cereal, rye, and winter pea. And that'll come up and it'll be 3 foot tall about the time that farmer wants to plant. I said, well, now he can't plant. Well, there's 100-year-old almost technology. That's one called roll crimpers. And it's just a big wheel that just rolls everything flat like a mat. But instead of just being a flat surface, it has ridges on it. And these ridges take the stalks of these plants and they crimp them. So this innate, I hate to use terms like the plant thinks because it doesn't think like we do, but that's the only language we have to describe this. The plant believes, thinks, what have you, that the top part of it is still doing its work so it doesn't resprout new growth. But
isn't this a device
where you bring the cambium, we're killing the root system and it dies, and we plant into that. Now you think about like a home garden. Well, what do? Because we have small plots of land, we take straw or hay. I wouldn't use hay because it's got so much seed in it, but straw or wood chips, and we put down this layer of mulch and we plant under that, and our soil stays so much nicer. It stays a lot more mediated. It evaporates less, right? And it stays cooler, and the plant's roots do better. Well, what you've just done is by throwing down seed and then terminating that seed, that's what we call it, as a cover crop termination, we created that same effect. We didn't have to bring, like, how would you bring in the mulch for 1,000 acres, let alone 40,000 acres? It's not doable. And here's the thing, for all the talk of subsidies and the government will pay for this. Existing farmers can get more money to put down cover crop than the cover crop costs through NRCS programs. So it's not like there's no studies needed. There's no government programs. All we need to do is the hardest thing, change the mindset of the farmer. And the average farmer in America today is like 66 years old. I try to learn new things every day, but I'm in my 50s, and I'll admit that, like, if I know how to do something, getting me to do it a new way, I'm not exactly on board with, especially if my life depends on it or my property and my mortgage and my debt payments depend on it. So we have this kind of social impediment, right? And there's farmers that talk about this, how when they went to no-till and they went to cover cropping, that farmers around them like would shun them because they didn't have bare dirt when they were supposed to. And that sounds like some primitive thing from like sub-Saharan Africa or something, but it's right here in Iowa or South Dakota or Kansas or Texas that people have this mindset, and they've been programmed this way. And I don't mean this maliciously. If you give a guy a job and his job is to sell fertilizer and seed and herbicide, he's going to follow his training. Well, if you do that for 40, 50, 60 years, multi-generational farms of having the guy they trust come in and tell them things that they really believe about, you need to do this. We just did a test. You need this much nitrogen. You need this much glyphosate, whatever. They believe it. And now you're asking them to do this kind of weird new age hippie shit, which is really just biomimicry and following nature. And it's a hard thing to move. It's an uphill battle for sure.
Isn't that device you're talking about the one that people have used to fake UFO landings and shit like that? I'm pretty sure it is. Or they've also used like the large piece of rectangular plywood and 2 pieces of rope to do exactly what you're talking about, right? Now that
Yeah, you're laying down a crop circle.
yeah,
Basically.
yeah. I mean, essentially that's what you're doing, but
Yeah.
the having the like if you just cut it all down, if you went through with a machine and cut everything down at the base, it's just going to start
Yeah.
growing again, right? So it's gonna continue pulling nutrient out of the ground when that's not what you want fucking growing at that time.
It depends, right? So the cover crop strategy is about the right species at the right time for the right goal. And this is why, like, when I talk about this on my show, I get, well, what mix should I use? Well, what are you trying to do? Are you going to graze it? Are you going to crimp it? Are you going to flame terminate it? Or do you want to let nature do it? So there are crops that if we plant them at the right time and the right sequence, we don't even have to do anything. Right. So, for instance, here in Texas, one of my favorite cover crops is winter pea. It's got about 2 to 3 more weeks left in it before it gets too hot and it's just going to die. Or if we plant something like a daikon radish that makes these huge columns down into the soil, as soon as we get down into like low 20s, high teens, it's all going to die. So the roll crimping that I'm talking about, that's just one way to do that termination. But you're correct. Let's say we're doing something like cereal rye, and we're in a much more northern climate than you and I are. In Texas, cereal rye is also going to bake off and die from just heat exposure in our springs. But if you're in South Dakota, you gotta do something to it. So like you mentioned, the guys that make the crop circles with like a 2x4. The problem with that is you're just folding it,
Right.
and what you need is something that actually kinks into the straw, and that's going to basically cause the plant itself to starve. And then the next thing you're going to do is you're going to plant into it, and large scale producers will use something called a no-till drill, which basically just sticks seeds into the ground, just like a regular farmer does, except we haven't plowed first.
Right.
And you're basically planting into a mat. And if some of that cover crop comes back, it's not really that big a deal because we've so disadvantaged it. The crop or group of crops that we've put down are going to outcompete it. And then if we're really smart, we want to go ahead and at the end of like a cover crop rotation, we'll go and we'll bring animals in and graze those cover crops. So if you're going to do that, you might pick different crops based on when you're going to want to graze them. So one of the most famous guys doing this right now is a guy named Gabe Brown up in South Dakota. And he's using like at any given time, like 400 acres of his operation is under cover, even when it could be under a cash crop. And then he's grazing behind that and then bringing the cash crop after the grazers move out. And his soil is up in the neighborhood of like 6.5% organic matter. And then someone will tell you, well, you can do that in South Dakota, but you can't do it in Texas. But the person in South Dakota will tell you can do it in Texas, but you can't do it in South Dakota. There's this idea that somehow this technology is geographically dependent or climatically dependent, and all that changes is the species that we use for it. And this is just one aspect of this stuff, by the way.
Yeah, I wonder about some of the biology behind this stuff. I mean, the stuff you're talking about with the fungal networks makes a lot of sense because I wonder how destroying that network affects how rainwater interacts with the soil, right? Like the drainage part of it, whether it's flushing nutrients out of the soil or whether the carbon and phosphorus that are coming from rain clouds is actually getting into the soil in the first place, or if it's just like escaping because there's nothing there to grab it, right?
Well, on the water, this is huge. So if we have the type of soil we're talking about building today, where we have these root systems in the soil, we have biological activity, we have worms moving and migrating up and down in the soil. And I've seen things where they put radioactive tracer dye on the worms, and it looks like some modern art, of all these columns. And rain falls, and we have a residue and an armor on the soil. Rain's falling at about 60 miles an hour. It hits bare soil, big old poofs of dust go flying, right? But if it hits a mat of vegetation, it kind of hits the soil. And then what does it do is it infiltrates. It goes into the soil, okay? And without that, not only do we not have a complete carbon cycle, now we don't have a complete water cycle. Water is not supposed to run across the ground into the river. It's supposed to go into the ground and weep slowly into the rivers and streams. And that way it gets to filter through the earth. So let me ask you this. If water does not infiltrate into the soil when the rain falls, what are the only other two things it can do?
Well, drain off into some larger body of water or sit on top of it, I guess, and get fucking gross.
Right. So it could either it can either pond or run off.
Right.
If it ponds, then eventually it evaporates.
Yeah.
Now, if
Which
it's
is that's a
rainwater,
net neutral, right? That doesn't benefit anybody at all. But even running
no,
into the river, you're probably carrying a lot of the soil nutrients into the river instead of like if you're on a farm and you have a low water table and you're tilling your field, you're like double fucking yourself, right?
yep, yep. So let's push that out for a second. Let's stick with the ponding first before we get to the runoff. The runoff is the bigger problem. But have you ever had like a spot in your lawn where something killed the grass and then the water ponds, and then every time it rains, it gets worse and it eventually looks like concrete? The ground gets so compacted that water just won't go into it, even though right over here it's going into it. And so that's best case scenario because at least it's rainwater.
Right.
Now our farmer that has this problem and the water won't infiltrate, and he's in West Texas growing cotton. What is the solution? Why are all of the fields, when you look down, circular? They have a well and a big rotating arm irrigator. And they'll say, well, I can't grow without irrigation. Okay, fine. We'll just pretend that's true for right now. Great, you're going to use irrigation. So now we're pumping water out of the ground. We're putting it on the surface. We're putting a lot of water down to get enough infiltration to keep the plant alive. Most of the water is sitting there if it's a nice flat field or it's puddling somewhere, and then it's evaporating. What's it going to leave behind?
I don't know. What would it leave behind?
Mineral salts.
So you're
It's going to
salting
leave
your own
salt,
earth.
right? So you're salting your own earth. There's, obviously the water we pump out of the ground that we call fresh water is not salty like the sea, but it does have salts in it. And if we go through, decades of putting that water on the soil surface and having it evaporate, we're constantly salting the soil. So it's like going out and spraying salt on your field. And then we tell the farmer, well, let's go organic. So the farmer sources a whole bunch of dairy manure, and it's 5% salt by dry weight. So now we're throwing salted manure and salted irrigation on the field and killing the biology. And so that's just like the what I call it with my ducks when they get too active in there. I call it duckcrete, where they pack it all down and it just the water won't go in. And you have to do something to correct that. You put down a seed and maybe a mulch over it, and the roots are what actually will correct that problem. Then the other problem is runoff. So this is something that always shocks people. The number one export that the United States has based on tonnage is extremely valuable, and we get no money for it. It's topsoil. We export more topsoil and wind and water into our oceans and streams every year than any other 10 products put together that we export to other countries to get money for. And here's a little factoid. How much soil do you think it takes to remove, like thickness, to remove a ton of topsoil from that 1 acre that we talked about earlier?
2 inches.
The thickness of a piece of paper.
Oh my God, dude.
If we run a ton off of an acre, it will accumulate. It's a single sheet of paper across 1 acre. So when we start saying, well, I only lost a centimeter of topsoil, and farmers will say that, and they'll be we only lost a few millimeters of topsoil. You lost tons per the acre. Now, how many years can we keep doing this? So we have the runoff, and then we have the compaction and the salt problem, and that again. I hate to always make things that seem so reductionist, but it's still back to biology. Healthy, biologically active soil will always infiltrate water. It just will. And I mean, there's tests like what's called the rain test, where they will take different plots, like basically cut a piece of sod a few inches deep of soil from different farms. And they have a little machine that'll just sit there and run water on it, simulating, let's say, a half inch of rainfall over an hour. And almost all the water on the conventional farm fields will just run off and be this dirty, murky, milkshake looking stuff where it collects the water. And then you take that brick of sod that just had half inch of water dumped on it, and you break it open, it's still bone dry, just an inch below the surface. I mean, surely you've seen this somewhere where we don't get rain for a while and it's an unhealthy ecosystem, and we get a good downpour, and you think, man, it must have really soaked in. You walk out and you just take your toe and you scrape the ground, and a centimeter deep, it's bone dry.
Yeah. I mean, you can, here in Texas, especially during the summertime, it'll rain, and then a couple of hours later, you'll see the earth start to crack because it's drying and breaking apart.
Yep. And that is What that actually is, either we've killed all the biology, that's one way. The other way is if the ground totally does dry out, some of the microorganisms in there will go into survival mode. You ever see like these, documentaries of Africa where it's like a frog and he climbs down in the desert sand and he puts like a coating around himself and then he might be down there for 5 years and when they get a good rain, he'll come out. I don't know if you've ever seen stuff like that, but there's creatures that's how they live.
Yeah.
Well, our microorganisms will do the same thing. They'll basically wrap a bubble around themselves of a biofilm, and it's a survival instinct. They kind of go dormant, and it will take a heroic amount of rainfall to break the surface tension and change that soil from hydrophobic back to hydrophilic. This is another thing. Like people get into this stuff and they go to the store and they buy bags of topsoil. If that bag of topsoil was ever allowed to dry it out, even if like somebody soaked it through with a hose or something, you're gonna have just massive amounts of problems ever breaking that hydrophobic nature of the soil. If anybody's ever bought a bag of potting soil, threw it in the garage after they used half of it, forgot about it for 6 months, and it's like bone dry, and I'll throw it in a container. You throw it in a container and you fill it up with water, and the water runs straight through it, and it's all bone dry. That's hydrophobic. And most of our farm fields are now hydrophobic, and we're irrigating hydrophobic soils.
Yeah, I think that things that are obvious or the standard or principle in biology are probably obvious throughout all of biology, regardless if it's human, mammal, other animal, or plant life or whatever. I also think that there are parallels and cycles the way we do things between biological and sociological factors, like the way cities grow, the way that we go through cycles as like in communities and shit like that. The way you're describing what we've done to the soil sounds remarkably like what we've done to our gut biome over the last 200 years or so, right? Let's say more like 150, right, since antibiotics kind of came around. But it sounds like we have biome issues in the soil now and this is I've told people this for years now, the bioavailability of nutrients in the vegetables you eat. Like, I don't eat them that much anyways, because to me, a plant, like everything in nature, has the ability to defend itself. A plant, like a animals have teeth and claws, legs to run away, a brain to think, whatever. Plants can either bury themselves in the ground or become bio-unavailable in one way or another, whether it being poisonous or undigestible, right? So it's like if something grows under the ground or if it has thorns on it, I'll probably eat it. But if it doesn't, if there's no obvious self-defense mechanism on that plant, I'm not eating that shit. That's just like that seems really obvious to me.
There is definitely the fact that plants are masters of chemical warfare is a good way to describe it. And it's exactly what you said. The plant can't run away. It can't hide. It can't fight back directly. So it has to fight back either with something sharp and pointy. And some of the best tasting food in the world has sharp points on it. Just think of blackberries, right?
Yep.
And think about that. That's like the plant actually controlling the animal. So I'm going to put these nasty thorns on. I'm going to make these hard little white and eventually red berries that taste like absolute ass. Nothing will come in and fight for that.
Yeah.
But when they turn dark, black, and sweet, the animal will move in and risk being scratched up to eat that luscious little treat. And then it's going to swallow it and it's going to poop it out somewhere. And that seed is going to be encapsulated in manure and grow a new blackberry plant. So a plant producing something like a blackberry or a fruit where the seed is consumed, the plant benefits from that happening. It actually propagates itself. And the plant that's most palatable will be the most successful at propagating itself with that formula. Now let's turn that to the food that most people think of when they say plant-based diet that we eat. And anybody that thinks Americans need to be on a plant-based diet, we are. Americans get 70 to 80% of our calories from plants, especially if you include alcohol. And I've never seen alcohol made out of meat. So
not yet. I'm working on it. I'm working on it.
Right. 70 to 80% though, right? We're getting right now as Americans from plants, and we have obesity epidemic. We have a type 2 diabetic epidemic. There's literally at this point almost more diabetic, dialysis clinics, and it's mostly diabetics type 2. That they're for, then there are Subway sandwich shops, right? So like between me and Fort Worth, which is like a 15-mile drive, there's 3 dialysis clinics on one road, right? Like this is what we've created with this mindset of doing this. And what did we do it with? We did it with plants like wheat, barley, rye, right? Beans, etc. Now, what do those plants gain by you eating them?
I don't know, to be honest.
Nothing. Nothing.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like,
If you eat an apple as a human, we're like a giant smart ape. So
yeah,
we
they're seeds.
leave the core and we throw the core. The apple tree gets a chance at making a baby apple.
Mhm.
If we're a deer and we eat an apple and we put our little deer pellets everywhere, the apple tree gets a chance at making a new apple. If you eat the head of a wheat plant, that wheat plant gets absolutely, positively nothing in return for its trouble. You've taken away its ability to reproduce. It has not formed a symbiotic relationship with things that consume it. It's formed an adversarial relationship with things it does not wish to be eaten. So, humans are smart, and we figured out how to, with selective breeding, breed things that are less toxic or use certain processing techniques to make things that would be out and out toxic less toxic. One of the most eaten things in the world is manioc, right? And if you don't prepare that right, you can kill yourself with it. It's a tuber plant for those that don't know. And we've taken all sorts of plants from across the planet that if they were just eaten in their raw form, either we would not be able to physically consume them. Can you imagine going out into a wheat field, ripping the heads off wheat, and just eating it?
Yeah.
You'll choke it, right? You'll choke it. That plant doesn't want you to eat it.
Mm-hmm.
So the more toxic a plant is, generally, you look at it, and it's a plant that benefits the least by being consumed. So your instinct of if it's got thorns, and whatever, and it can defend itself, I'm more likely to eat it, is well founded. And the bigger one is, does the plant benefit? Now, I eat things that don't necessarily benefit by me eating them. I just don't eat large amounts of them. I like Swiss chard, I like arugula, different leafy greens and stuff. But I see them more as, when we look at herbal medicine, the poison is the dose. So we can take something that a small amount of it is tonifying and actually improves our function and our immune systems and everything else. But if we took a large amount of it, it'll kill us dead. I beat up Big Pharma all the time. God knows they deserve it. But I'm glad antibiotics exist because, something like bubonic plague killed like half of the people that even were exposed to it in the past. And now it's easy to cure if you catch it in time.
Mm-hmm.
So there are certain drugs that we have manufactured. And, it's interesting that antibiotics are pretty much natural substances. They're not synthetic. They're actually something that was created from a biological process. But there's some of those things that will help us. But if you overdose on them, they'll kill you. And so when you try to build a human diet off of purely plants, I don't think there's really a way to do that without having too many toxins in it. And I don't like to tell people how to live. And if you want to be a vegan or a vegetarian, then go forth and go ahead. But I would tell you that it would be if you came to me and I was acting as a nutritional consultant for you, I could do a pretty good job for a vegetarian. If they'll eat eggs and stuff, dairy and stuff, you're not going to survive as a vegan without supplementation. You're just not.
Yeah, there's no way, right? So,
Yeah.
but there are some, like, I'm the same. I like some vegetables. I just don't. Like, I understand that my relationship with them is at least to some degree adversarial, right? Because I like booze too. I'll drink booze sometimes, but I don't for a moment think that it's making my fucking physical life better, because it's definitely not.
I mean, right, there's been scientific studies where they say the person that drinks 2 glasses of wine in France or Italy is less likely to have heart attacks and chronic diseases than a person who doesn't. But no one's saying that the person who drinks 2 bottles of wine every day is going to be healthy. Right?
Yeah.
Like, again, we're back to the poison is the dose.
Yeah. So, I make, as far as bread goes, because when we talk about grain, that's primarily what we're talking about. I only eat it if I make it myself, right? Like if you
Awesome.
and it's mostly sourdough, to be honest, because it's actually got healthy biome and stuff in it. But if there's one thing I could convince people to stop doing, it would be to stop eating like anything in a bag or a box, but especially bread in a bag. Like if you buy bread from the grocery store in a bag, you're out of your goddamn mind. Like that is
not bread.
It's nonsense. Like it's half wood pulp bread. Half of the time, which is fine. Wood pulp isn't necessarily bad for you, but it's bleached and then recolorized half the time, which is insane. Like why the fuck are you doing that? Anyways.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
It's the worst thing it's the worst thing you know. So if you go back to like the 1920s back, there was a law in most countries and certainly in the United States that if wheat was lower than 18% protein, it was not fit for human consumption. It had to be tested, and if it was below 18%, it had to be used as animal feed or for something else. So there was that. But then the other thing is, all the old nostalgic pictures you see of the wheat fields after harvest, and instead of the wheat field being empty, there's all these big giant stacks of wheat put up in sheaves,
hmm
right? Bringing in the sheaves. That's where that comes from. So they would cut the wheat and they would stack it. Well, they didn't do that because somebody was like, "Hey, you know what would look really cool is if after we side the wheat down, we stacked it in these sheaths and took a picture of it with this newfangled camera. This was done for thousands and thousands of years." Well, if you were to go out to one of these old-fashioned harvests where they have that pile of wheat sitting there after about a week of it sitting there, and it would sit for several weeks, and stick your hand in the middle of it, you know what you would feel?
it would be wet.
Heat,
Yeah.
heat. It would be drying out, but it would also be hot. It would be
Mm.
going through a natural fermentation process. And so all the wheat up into the 1920s, harvest in the United States, had to be over 18%, and it had to be fermented in the field. And if it wasn't, well, then you ended up with basically animal feed.
Hmm.
And this is right when we had a lot of research going on. Science was becoming the new god in America, or what have you. And we had discovered things like vitamin D deficiencies in children causing rickets. And we knew we were heading into another world war. And a lot of things got shortcutted at that point. And this is one of many things that got shortcutted. Like, we made this decision so that we could increase the food supply. Because in World War One, we found out how many people in this country were suffering from malnutrition. It was something in the neighborhood of 30 to 40% of draftees were turned away in World War One because they weren't getting enough food. They weren't getting enough nutrition. That's when the school lunch programs and everything came in. So I'm not saying those two things are directly related. I'm saying there's a pretty strong correlation there that should be suspect.
Yeah.
But can you imagine that? Like 100 years ago, your great grandfather was not legally going to purchase for food the wheat that you're getting your Wonder Bread from.
Right. Yeah. That's not great for us.
No,
Um,
no.
but they also weren't. Well, our great grandfathers, anyways, weren't eating high fructose corn syrup and this other horse shit that has been, I mean, it's all shortcuts, right? And this
Do
is,
you know where that started? The
well,
fructose corn syrup.
it started to fatten up pigs. I don't know how it
mean,
got
the
into
human
human
food.
food, but I know the reason the first commercial use for it was to fatten up pigs before slaughter. I know that, but
Yep.
how did it get into human food?
So Ocean Spray was the first company to do it. And I was a weird kid back in the 80s. I was, a teenager, and as a teenager, I would watch shows like 2020 when they actually did news. So I remember this from all the way back then. They had a guy on. It was either 72 or 74. He was a lead product developer for Ocean Spray. And he said, "Hey, we should take this fructose corn syrup stuff and replace the sugar." And they said, "Well, why? Does it taste better?" He said, "Oh, no, it doesn't taste better. It costs less. But it tastes good enough. We can use it." And like, it's subsidized because they're subsidizing corn. It'll be super cheap. And his bonus the first year they did it was $9 million, and that's 1970s dollars. And he ended up buying a massive ranch in Wyoming, and he actually called it the Sugar Ranch. And we live in, like, for all the things that I love about capitalism, and you just, the flag behind me might indicate that, when we move into corporate crony capitalism, we move into the same reason that they want to keep, let's say, steroids out of sports. If you let steroids into sports, then at that elite level of professional sports to compete, then pretty much everybody has to do it.
Hmm.
So when we go into a situation where people are making spending decisions based on pricing, and Ocean Spray is all of a sudden taking all its sugary drinks and cutting its cost so it can make more profit selling at a lower, gross sale price, well, then Coke, Pepsi, et cetera, all have to move into it. I would imagine, I don't know how old you are, but most people that are just a little bit younger than me, and I'm like 52, have never actually tasted Coca-Cola I don't mean the cocaine formula from the 1800s, but I mean like what Americans that grew up in the 40s, 50s, 60s, et cetera, drank as Coca-Cola, right? It was made with cane sugar. And it was about the late 70s that that change was made. And so most people have never even had, unless you drank a Mexican one, right?
Hmm.
Like, I'm sure you're familiar with that, but
Yeah, I've had Mexican Coke. It definitely tastes different.
yeah, we used to have out in Dublin, was the original Dublin, Texas was the original Dr. Pepper plant, and they eventually sold it to somebody else. But for years, people would drive from Dallas Fort Worth out to Dublin to get Dublin Dr. Pepper because it was the only Dr. Pepper still made with real sugar.
Mm.
I'm not saying it was good for you.
Yeah.
I'm saying it was less bad because you're right. This fructose corn syrup. First of all, it's you mentioned the glyphosate. Well, it's laden with that. Or in the fructose corn syrup, actually, it's not glyphosate; it's atrazine. So they've developed genetic stacks in the corn where they can spray the corn with atrazine, which is a herbicide that will target other grasses, but yet it won't kill the corn.
Yeah.
So you've got this herbicide in it on top of it, but it's it's also a fructose, right? High fructose, so 2 fructose. You mentioned booze. If you look at how the liver processes fructose, there's only one small process in the whole thing that's different than how the liver processes alcohol. So we have these mothers trying to keep their kids healthy, feeding their little Johnny apple juice,
Yeah.
and it's got more sugar than a Coca-Cola, and it's fructose, and it's blowing this kid's liver up before he's even out of diapers.
Yeah, and it's also making them insulin resistant, which is why,
Correct.
38% of Americans right now are either diabetic or in pre-diabetes. Like we're getting dangerously close to half of the country having serious sugar issues, right? Because I mean, you can fuck yourself up by eating enough real sugar, but if you eat fake sugar, I think it's probably quite a bit worse because your body just loses all context and forgets how to process the sugar that you are eating.
And then if you're drinking alcohol,
Mm.
so you have to think about there's certain things your liver has to do that it can't multitask. Like it has to do this one thing, and until that one thing's out of your blood, it just doesn't do anything else. So if your favorite drink, let's say, is a screwdriver, and you're having it with Sunny Delight, right, where they've taken the orange juice that already has a lot of fructose in it, and they've added more, then everybody has to line up. So since the alcohol will kill you first, your body's innate intelligence will process the alcohol, but it has to process all the alcohol before it can process the fructose, and now it can process the glucose. Gee, why do you have insulin resistance? That's crazy, Like, so the rest of your metabolic process had to deal with this surplus of sugar in your blood, right? While it waited for these other things to move out. So I'm not a prude. I'm all for having an adult beverage here and there, but if you really want to kill yourself, mix sugar and alcohol together.
Yeah. That's why I've been telling people how smart I am forever for drinking straight whiskey all the time. There's your proof, bitch.
Yeah, and you'll drink less too, right?
Oh,
like
yeah.
I've never picked up a glass of. First of all, it's too expensive, right? But it's just not pleasant to take a glass of unsweetened, whiskey, whether it's neat or on a Death Star ice cube or whatever, and just chug it.
Mm.
Just don't behave that way, and if you do, you don't do it for very long. It's somewhat self-limiting.
Yeah. So I want to get into some of the nitty gritty here because a lot of people will hear all this and they're like, well, yeah, that's good information, but I, have a limited amount of space or I don't know what the fuck I'm doing, whatever. How can I, and what should I be growing and why? Like, for example, you mentioned earlier you were primarily carnivore, but also might be growing cereal, rye, and stuff like that. Like, not everything you're going to end up growing is for you to consume first, I think is a good thing to tell people. Like,
cereal rye I use as a cover, just for an example.
Yeah.
Like, I don't even feed that to my animals. So, like, we grow that through a winter, and then we terminate it and plant into it.
And then plant on top of it, yeah. I mean, that's part of, like, permaculture stuff, right?
Yeah.
But some stuff you're going to, like, Tucker Max, who likes mentioning you to me from time to time, I think he follows some of your stuff, is he's set up this chicken coop that's using that he's actually getting fertilizer out of, right? Mm-hmm. So he's used like the feathers that fall off of them and then their waste mixed with his compost, and that's what he uses to fertilize most of his fields and shit like that. Like all of these, you're not going to eliminate all waste. That's not how life works. But there's like nature provides, I think, is the maxim that I like to use. Like if you're looking for something, almost always you're going to find the solution in the problem somewhere, right? Because that's kind of how nature operates.
Correct.
So, like if you're if you're talking to somebody who's done none of this, but they want to start eating better food, first of all, I would say, even if you don't have the ability to do any of this stuff or the property to do any of this stuff, at least you should be looking to try to build a community farm with some other people that you know. Because if you haven't noticed yet by how this conversation has gone, factory farming is bullshit. Like it just doesn't scale. It can't. Like it's inefficient for them to make money on if it scales like that, unless they start
Yep.
taking shortcuts. You just can't have that stuff. So, like, what do you tell somebody who's done none of this but wants to get into it? Where do they start?
Sure. I mean, from a nutritional standpoint, the best thing to do is find somebody around you that's doing it and buy from them instead of the store. So I like most of my beef literally comes from a mile and a half down the road from me. And people think I live in the middle of nowhere, especially when they see my videos and stuff, because it is very rural looking. But again, it's 15 minutes to Fort Worth, right? It is not that far out. There is somebody near you that is probably, and beef is probably the number one superfood that I can recommend. Beef, along with like lamb, like any red meat, but beef is going to be the most universally available. That's also high fat. So, dude, grass feeds his cattle. I don't really want a whole cow at one time, so he always just pairs me up with another customer. He takes and you know this gets around all the regulations too. By the way, he takes the cow down to the processor for me. They take care of it, but I sign for the meat. It's basically my cow and this other guy's cow, who I won't even know who that guy is ever. It's not like I have a permanent buddy, right? And then the guy calls me up and says, "How do you want your meat done?" He'll ask me my cuts. That's super easy. Get a good deep freezer and start doing that. And that'll go a long way right there. And it'll cost you less money than buying meat in the store. It'll flat out cost you less money in the end to eat a better quality food. If you want to start producing your own food, look into first of all, start off, what are you going to eat? Like, don't grow food just to grow food, right? So if you're not going to eat potatoes, and I don't really think you should eat, I eat maybe 20 potatoes a year, right? Like they're like a treat.
All at once or what?
No, like,
I can just picture you eating 20 raw potatoes out of a bag like a psychopath.
No, like a couple times a year, and my thing is, if you want potato chips, don't eat Pringles, get a good potato and throw it through a mandolin and fry it in lard.
Yeah.
Right. So I mean like that, like spaced out through the year, maybe once or twice a month. And, Thanksgiving, Christmas, whatever. I'm like anybody else, man. I'll throw down and feast and then take a nap.
I'm potatoes like once a month. Usually it's a roast with carrots and potatoes and onions and shit like that. That's
a great, it's some duck fat, right? It's some duck fat on a potato. Yeah. That's about heaven. So first of all, figure out what you're going to grow that you're going to eat. And then you'll realize if you are living with a diet more like you and I live with, you don't need to grow that much.
Right.
Like a couple garden beds, 4 foot by 8 foot. Right now I'm working with a company called Lavore, and they'll sell you, it comes in a box. It's, about as big as a TV box thin.
Is that the black metal one that's on your website?
Yeah. You bolt it together. It takes about an hour and a beer to bolt it one together, and you fill it up and you start growing. And 2 of those, if you're going to grow some peppers and tomatoes and maybe some squash and greens, how much of that are you going to eat? Right? So that would be a good way to go. But I really advise people to look into producing protein. It's so much easier. 4 chickens in a small little mobile coop with even if in a suburban area, if you don't have a Karen neighbor that's too much of a pain in the ass, you can do this, and you move them every day. They improve your lawn. You'll mow your lawn less. Your lawn will be in better shape. And then at least you have eggs. Other really great animals to work with at that scale, quail. Like people say, I want chickens for eggs and meat. No, you don't. No, you don't. You either have to have land like mine, and you're working with, a very old heirloom breed like Jersey Giants or something, or you need meat chickens and you need egg chickens.
Yeah, they're not the same.
They're not the same, and something that's dual purpose excels at neither.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And then the Jersey Giants take a good 18 to 24 weeks to fully mature, where like a Cornish cross is like 8 weeks. Right. So you're not going to do that. But quail, you can raise quail in little 2 foot by 2 foot cages. You can get the best quality feed you want. And I like to feed any of my livestock. I also like to feed them like sprouts and microgreens and stuff like that to vary their diet. And they'll produce eggs for you. Like one quail sometimes will throw 2 eggs a day. About 3 quail eggs equals 1 chicken egg. And a quail will grow from hatched out of the egg to a size that you can process it for a meal in 6 weeks. 6 weeks. And when you, yeah, I don't know if you're a hunter or not, but
Hmm.
if you've hunted doves and you know how to clean a dove, you know how to clean a quail where you pull the breast out. The difference is the quail have enough on their thigh and their leg that you can pop the thigh and leg out and break the foot off.
Mm.
I can process the quail in literally 30 seconds with no tools, right? And that's taking the heart, the liver, pulling the gallbladder off the liver because you don't want to eat that; it tastes like ass.
Hmm.
The breast and the leg quarters in
Do you
30
put the
seconds.
stuff in a grind, the organ meat, or what do you do with it? You just cook it and eat it?
So I don't care for liver generally.
Hmm.
There's something about quail liver though; it's so delicate that if you just fry it in like a little like butter, like
Hmm.
ghee or something, it's pretty good. When I eat liver from like beef liver or whatever, it's just not what I want to eat. So what I'll do is I'll dice up like if I get a calf liver or whatever, I'll dice it up, throw it in the freezer before you do this, or you will hate your life. And once it's mostly frozen, put it through a grinder.
Yeah.
And then in all my ground beef, I will put 1 ounce of liver to 16 ounces of beef and mix that together. And that'll actually make your burgers and all that kind of stuff taste better.
Yeah.
And you get all that nutrient value of the liver. Like the only two livers that I'll eat straight up are quail and rabbit, and both of them are really delicate and quite delicious. Heart to me, I anybody that says they don't eat heart and then turns around and eats meat, it's in. I don't mean to pick on people, but it's in your head.
Yeah.
Like
I
a
mean,
liver
it's
is
just
a
a
filter,
muscle.
a heart is a muscle,
Yeah.
and a steak is a muscle, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, to be honest, if you had a heart prepared correctly, I'm not sure the average person would even notice the difference.
Now you'd think it's pepper, but I make it till it's a little bit. It's got to stay rare.
Mm.
It's very easy to overcook. Um, Most of the times, people think that what really makes a piece of meat a tough piece of meat is it doesn't have a lot of fat.
Mm.
Yeah, but tenderloin has almost no fat and it's incredibly tender, right? So that's not the case. What it is how much the muscles used and how dense the fibers are. So a heart from the moment that it forms in an embryo until the resulting critter dies, and that includes us, it beats nonstop. So it's always in motion. It never rests, right? And on a side note, like if you got the stabby stab and you have heart injury, there's a reason it will never heal because how do you heal a wounded muscle?
Right.
You rest it.
Yeah, you
So
have to
you
rest
can't
it.
rest the heart. So you got to really gently cook heart, but it's delicious. It's also a great if you're doing sausages or anything like that. Like we do duck sausage because we raise ducks here, and our ducks are egg-laying ducks, so they're just not a good meat bird. So when we do have to cull, like maybe we have to cull like a dozen of them,
Hmm.
I just take the breast meat and the leg quarter meat and the heart and liver, and I'll splash a little Armagnac in that, and I'll make duck sausage out of it. And I'll cut it with about 40% pork to add fat and volume to it. And that's $25 a pound stuff that we're
Yeah.
making for $2 a pound.
Yeah, yeah. So I want to go back just a little bit for people in the audience. So
Yeah.
you have no access or capability or whatever to plant anything or have animals around. At least find somebody locally where you can source those things outside of a mass factory farm for sure, right? That would be the first thing. I would say
Yep.
beef, eggs, and raw milk at a minimum, right? If you use milk products, I don't know if you do or not, but I make my own cheese and shit like that. So
Yeah. Yep.
and it's incredibly easy, by the way, to make like mozzarella cheese. It's going to take you like an
Super
hour,
simple.
maybe. I mean, it's so easy. You just pour like citric acid and milk and water into a pot, heat it up to 90 degrees, take it off, put rennet in, and let it sit there for like 5 minutes until
Yep.
it curds. And then like seriously, you just kind of stir it around a little bit, pull the curds out, drain, start pulling the whey out with hot water, and that's it. Like seriously, it's less than an hour sometimes to get that whole
We
process
make
done.
cheese while we make fertilizer, and we use rice, and we use milk, and we don't eat the rice.
What do you use the rice for, to filter?
So the rice actually has natural yeasts on it that will cause the curdling and fermentation. It takes a little bit longer to make your cheese this way.
So you're using that instead of citric acid?
So we'll rinse the rice
Mm,
and we get a cloudy water
yeah.
and we will then imbibe the milk with that and that will form a curd and that'll make your cheese. But the reason we're doing that is we take the whey, which is full of
Mm,
lactic acid
yeah.
bacteria, and we're using that in our gardens or in our aquatic system. So we'll dump that whey like straight into our fish
Mm,
tanks. And that lactic acid bacteria is so aggressive that it will do things like a lot of times you keep fish together in tanks. Like if you go to like a Bass Pro Shop or something, you see these little white weird things. All they don't look right. They have injuries around their face, and that's because they all like peck at each other and
mm,
stuff. So it'll clear that right up. We can also spray it on plants and help them grow. And then we take the rice and we'll cook that like partially. And we use like I'm going off on a tangent here, but
mm,
we'll take that rice and we'll put it out in a little box and we'll use it to do what's called indigenous microorganism capture. So this is a form of Korean natural farming, where we'll actually capture these microorganisms that we were talking about and cultivate them and put them into stasis so that we can use them later. And so we're function stacking all that together. I don't know that that really hits on what people that can't grow anything can do. I mean, they need to find somebody to buy from.
yeah, yeah,
But
certainly.
I would be really cautious before you determine that you can't do something, right? Like you can grow herbs in pots on your patio and start to form that connection. And, herbs are one of the things I grow a lot of because, meat tastes really good with rosemary and thyme,
Mm,
right? So, and by weight, it's some of the most expensive stuff you can grow. But really, looking into producing your own meat, rabbits are another one. Rabbits are kind of my go-to for people who want self-sufficiency, and the reason is with a nice lawn that you don't true green cam lawn, good like Dutch white clover, New Zealand clover mix into your lawn, and a bagging lawnmower. You can feed your rabbits without buying anything. You cut the grass, you feed the rabbits the grass that you need to store for the winter. You can go on YouTube and put in how to make a mini hay baler. And with some plywood and all, you can make little bales and you can build and make your own hay for your rabbits for the down season. And then the rabbits poop and the poop goes back to the yard and then the yard grows. And then you have a complete cycle right in your yard. If you have a little bit of room, even like just like your back fence line, then you can go in and plant a tree like hybrid willow or hybrid poplar or white mulberry. And then you treat those trees like shrubs and we keep them pruned in what's called a pollard and they keep growing back. And so now we have grass and we have fodder from the tree to feed our rabbits. And now we have a complete system. And for all the talk of rabbit starvation and all that's not a thing. That's people living on rabbits in the mountains where the rabbits had no fat.
mm,
And what they got sick and died from was a lack of fat.
yeah.
So cook your rabbits in butter and cook your rabbits in bacon grease and shut up. And now you have an endless supply of protein from your backyard, even in a small suburban lot. And if anybody asks, like Karen next door, well, those are my pet rabbits.
Yeah, they just die from time to time, as
Yeah,
rabbits are wont to do. Obviously.
yeah, yeah. Sometimes they reproduce, and sometimes the babies disappear. Maybe I sold them, maybe I ate them. You don't need to know, Karen. Go back to life.
Yeah, so those are some like pretty simple things you could do at a minimum. Yeah, I would agree with you. At a minimum, grow some herbs and find somewhere. Like I buy meat from one local place here, and I buy from a farm in Missouri as well. Just because my buddy happens to deliver their meat all over the place, so he will bring it right to my
Yep.
house. So I'm not going to say no to that, obviously. To get beef at $12, like high quality beef at $12 a pound, $11 a pound.
Yeah.
It's not too bad. It could be better, but I don't have to go to a grocery store for meat ever, which is nice.
Yep.
And yeah, I mean, here in Texas, we're kind of lucky with that stuff, to be honest, because we, there probably are some food deserts in this state to some degree, but this is an issue of infrastructure building as well, right? So one of the themes of this show is if you truly do believe in limited government, like people say that they do, then stop taking shit from the government. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
you're patronizing their business when you take their money or take their handout. And the same thing goes for big box stores and all this other stuff. But if you patronize local meat suppliers, then you're insulating your community from external bullshit to some degree, right?
Well, you start to create this circular economy too, right?
Mm,
Like, let's keep the money next door, right? Like, I'd rather spend my money with my neighbor whose entire supply line, or at least some portion of it, is local to me. Even if you're buying from a local business, if they're importing all their product from China and their financing comes from a New York City bank and all of their suppliers are not local to you, you still have a net bleed out of your economic. You have an economic entropy going on. And if you look at America and you look at the destruction of America, the most productive parts of America when it comes to keeping people alive are the most impoverished, and that should never be the case. What did the royals do in the days of the serfs? They owned all the land, right? The productive land was the literal wealth of the world. And why was that the case? Well, I believe it's because we lived in a hard money economy, and you could only get so much gold, and you needed something of value to exchange for it. Nobody could print money. And every time we've printed money, this is what's happened. The people that work the hardest, that the most people depend on, suffer the greatest because they actually have to live in the world of reality, and everybody else gets to live in a world of make-believe, and we're able to take make-believe money and exchange it for real food. And now we've gone even worse where we're exchanging make-believe money for what I would call make-believe food.
Yeah.
Like this, the stuff the average person eats is not food. Cheetos are not food. And I'm not being a prude. Read the label. Cheetos are not food. The shit that's in there is not meant for you to eat. And what will really drive that home for you, get somebody you know in Europe or England or whatever, and I'm definitely not saying they're right or we're wrong everywhere, but in this one case, have them get whatever it is you eat, Cheetos, Pringles, whatever garbage crap you eat, have them take their phone and take a picture of the ingredients on a bag of Doritos from London and then go down to Walmart and get a bag of Doritos, and about half of what's in yours isn't in theirs.
Not only is it not in there, but it's illegal in those countries. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. That's why they're not there, because those ingredients are illegal, but yet it's being subsidized and fed to you in this country. Now, clearly, we do not need it to make a Dorito, because if you eat a Dorito in London, and I have, it tastes exactly like a Dorito in the United States. So what the hell is that there for? To me, I don't mean to sound conspiratorial, but when I look at the totality of all of this, I see it as an overriding system that is designed to weaken the health of the average person so that we are more able to be submitted to their will.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's something.
Have a better explanation.
There's something called Hanlon's razor that says, "Don't imply malice when incompetence will suffice," but it doesn't. And at this point, it doesn't fucking matter if it's on purpose or not, because the effect is the same. We have 40% less testosterone than the generation prior to us, and it's going to be 40% less for the next generation if we don't fucking do something about it, right? Like it does. Yeah. I agree with you. I think it's like half incompetence and half malevolence. Like, because we hear for every, like, I don't necessarily think that Bill Gates is an evil genius or anything like that. I think he's the typical what do you call it, patrician asshole who thinks they know better than everybody else. Like, it's my job to feed all the people, so I've got to make sure I can do it, and we're gonna have to cut some corners and knock down bioavailability a little bit to get it done. It's like, no, it's not your job to feed people. Actually, it's your job to shut the fuck up, shut up, get out of here. You know what I mean? But there are those WEF cunts who say things like, "You'll own nothing and be happy." I'm like, nah, dude, I don't think so. Like, you shouldn't even exist. So here's how
I look at that whole concept of, is it malice or is it incompetence? I'll just say, okay, let's give them a pass and say that when we started all this green revolution bullshit and pouring acid on rock to make fertilizer and using the same chemicals that we used in World War I to make pesticides with, that it was all incompetence. It was all, they could see that it would actually produce more output, and they didn't understand the consequences of what they were doing, and it was incompetence, or it was misguided, good intentions that went awry. Okay, how long do you let really smart people do that before you say, okay, I gave you a pass, but at this point, you know what the fuck you are doing, right? Because like you said, you can't look at the testosterone levels in men in America today and not say, there's a problem here. We can't look at the autism rates and not say, hey, there is a problem here. We can't look at the rates of type 2 diabetes, the fact that we have children with type 2 diabetes. Again, I don't know exactly how old you are, but I'm old enough that I remember when I was in high school and middle school, there was like a fat kid.
Yeah.
And when I talk to anybody that's like up over 40, 45 years of age, usually that person, if you say, who was the fat kid in your high school? They actually remember the name of the fat kid. Today, you might know who the skinny kid is, right? I mean, like kids are just not health. Like the fact that we have childhood obesity. And then here's another startling thing to me when you look at the whole food supply and this whole system of just toxins. The fattest people in this country are the poorest. That doesn't make any sense
No.
unless it's intentional.
Yeah, I
Right?
mean, I agree to
Poor
some
people
degree. Yeah,
historically were skinny. They were starving. They were out begging for alms in the street. Today, the poorest people in America are the most obese society we have.
yeah. Well, I mean that makes sense though, right? Because we have shitty food. Like we have high calorie, low nutrient food. So we have, for the first time in human history, we have people who are simultaneously obese and malnourished. Like it's never ever happened before, ever in the history of human beings. Nor should it have.
Not in
I mean,
mass. I'm
how
not
could
going
it
to say
have?
never because it might have happened somehow somewhere, but it was never like an entire society.
Right, that's
There's
what I
no-
mean. Yeah, yeah. Like
Yeah.
an entire country wasn't suffering from this. There's no like,
Well, and if I
how could it have
feed
been?
Let's say I'm giving you a food and it's very low in some key nutrients your body needs, but it's very high in calories.
Mm-hmm.
What is your body going to tell you to do?
Eat more. Yeah,
Like, you don't have to be a nutritionist to know that.
yeah. I mean, you've seen
Even
like
if you've
animals,
never
like
thought of it before.
squirrels will start fucking eating bullshit that people feed them, and they'll just get morbidly obese. Like, yeah, because the squirrel's brain is telling it to eat whatever fucking food it can find, because food is scarce in the wild, right?
Correct. Well, so here's an interesting thing you just hit on. Tell me an animal that is obese for its species that isn't eating our garbage or in one of our cages in nature. Any animal, now you might say an elephant, they're not obese, that's what they're supposed to look like. Any animal in nature eating its natural food is never obese in the way that we think of it.
Not
For
a lot
its
of
species.
yeah, not a lot of heart disease in the wilderness.
No.
I mean,
No.
it's fucking
If you
stupid.
find a fat animal, and again, a rhinoceros or whatever, they have certain, like, they're carrying their fat where they're supposed to. It's part of their entire evolution. If you find a truly obese, like obese to the point of being infirmed animal, it's eating our garbage, or it's a pet, or it's in a zoo. There are no fat lions.
Yeah.
There are no fat tigers. Now, people will say, well, they have to run around all the time. Have you watched cats? Cats don't do that shit. Cats spend most of their time sleeping, right? But they're eating what is biologically they have evolved to consume. There's no way we biologically evolved to consume wheat or rye or corn, because if you tried to live on, well, corn I'm going to throw it to the side for now. We can talk about later if you care why. All these other plants have wild analogs. Like there is a wild rice, there's a wild wheat, there's a wild rye, right? And they can be harvested for food. They are net energy losses, right? You have to create a hierarchical society of slave labor to process grains. And if you don't have a slave labor force, then what you have is a mechanized fossil fuel energy input force. So you either have a whole bunch of people with scythes, or you have a combine, right? So there's no way we can evolve as a natural species, human beings walking around bare feet in the woods that have just figured out how to tie a piece of animal skin around their crotch so they don't scratch their balls, right? On a thorn. Like that person can't live on the food that we eat today. Not because I say so, not because Jack Spirko's a carnivore and believes that you should keep your body in a state of at least somewhat ketosis most of the time. No, because you physically can't fucking do it. It can't be done. It's not possible. You'll die trying to live that way. So what we probably one of the most consumed foods in the world as societies begin to coalesce. We all have this marvelous fiction, I call it, where we think it's exactly what the scientists say, who've been wrong about everything else, by the way, that society is formed around agriculture. And that's where all human civilization is, from agriculture. No wonder we almost worship it as a society.
Well, that's not how
But-
Rome popped up. Rome popped up around water.
Water is the key. And if we have water before everybody's shitting and pissing in it, almost every stream, river, bay, estuary is full of what? That doesn't run away. That's very nutritious. Shellfish.
Yeah.
Right? There are places in America where there are mounds that are bigger than like industrial buildings. And when they dig into those mounds, it's oyster shells. There's ones in Florida that are like, they look like pyramids, but when you uncover them, it's all shellfish. This is something humans could evolve eating, right? In the Pacific Northwest, the natives there will tell you if you want breakfast, take a walk in the forest, and when you want dinner, wait for low tide.
Mm-hmm.
Right? This hunter-gatherer society that we've created this little fiction around that these people were all very primitive, very small bands, whatever. Some of the first civilizations, like some of the really, like 1491 is a great book for your folks to check out and read by Mann is the guy's, like George C. Mann, I think is the author's name. But he talks about the earliest civilization now that they've been able to find is in the western coast of Peru, and it was built on fish. And what they did farm was cotton. And the people that farmed the cotton used it to control the other people in the area because they were dependent on the cotton for the nets to catch the fish. Right? And this is like 4000 BC. When science recently was saying that there were no civilizations in the Americas at all at that time, just these wandering bands, this massive civilization grew in Western Peru on the coast, and the diet was heavily based on fish, almost exclusively, a little bit of fruit. And they know this because they can do genomic analysis of the skeletal remains they find. And by looking at what your bones are made of, they can tell what you ate. That's, I get on science, the TM science, trademark science a lot. But there's good solid science where you can look at a skeleton and say, this is what this guy's bones are built of. So we know what built his bones.
Yeah, that whole agriculture developed society. I mean, that's nonsense. Clean water is what develops a society, and that and defensible territory are the two primary things. So I mean, like Rome bought most of its food from other places. I mean, it's protein it's sourced somewhat locally, but the grain and everything came from Egypt. I mean, that they had a fucking 1,000-year relationship to get grain from Egypt. And
it destroyed North Africa.
Yeah, well.
Right? It just there are places that they find these ruins now in northern Africa, and they realize there had to be rivers, lakes, etc. It's all desert now.
Yeah.
No living person can remember it being anything but a desert. But when you let's go back. There's no wheel, okay? There's no wheel. There's no airplanes, and you have a society with 600,000 people living not on the coast in Africa where there's a desert today. If there wasn't water at the time that civilization was there could have been 600,000 people there. Mm-hmm. There could have been 6,000 people there. Can you imagine somebody drops you off in the Mojave with 6,000 of your buddies, badasses, military guys, know how to take care of themselves? You're still going to fucking starve. You have to have water. Now, the other side of that is, this is even more important to society. You don't have a wheel, you don't have a car, you don't have an electric motor, you don't have a gas motor, you don't have an airplane. How are you going to move shit?
Slaves,
and okay, they can still only move as much. In, fuel out. Like there's still a limit there.
I mean, you're carrying it like in a fucking what do you call it?
Boat. You move it with a boat.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's true.
Boating, right? And so it's not a surprise that even today the biggest cities in the world are all either on rivers or oceans. Right? Like because if you have water, you can survive. There's resources and there's abilities to transport things. It doesn't take humans very long to figure out, hey, if I strap 10 of these logs together, I can put shit on it and float it down the river.
Yeah. I mean, we've seen there's some evidence that to defeat tides and stuff like that, we would sink or to carry things that were super heavy, we would sink ships down below the water and then put like a giant obelisk or a huge piece of wood on it and then remove the ballast and let it come back up to the surface and then sail. Sure. Like human beings are pretty fucking smart when it comes to doing stuff. I guess necessity is the mother of invention, they say. But it's really interesting to see how we've evolved with some of this stuff because we're making a lot of the same mistakes now that the Roman Empire made. I mean, if you think about what Rome was doing, they were an increasingly socialistic society, right? I mean, it ebbed and flowed like anything will, but because at one point they banned slavery in the city because slaves were doing all the work and freedmen had no work to do. I mean, they tried to make corrections over time, but it was an increasingly socialistic society that used mass farming, albeit from somewhere else, mostly from Egypt, to feed low quality calories to people essentially for free, right? A huge burden to the state, and all doing this at the same time is doing what all governments do, which is extract labor and wealth from the population, right? That is not a fucking cycle that you want to be in, frankly, because The only people getting out good in that are the people at the very top. And I don't know what physical structure in the entire universe is stronger at the top than it is at the bottom, but I haven't found it yet.
Yeah, yeah. I think that you're hitting on exactly why there's so much resistance into the types of things that we're talking about today. You would think that the government would be all for a self-sufficient, self-reliant people that have plenty of food. But people that have plenty of food are a problem in this mindset. And again, I'm a capitalist by the pure definition of the word. But when we start saying capitalist in its form today and socialist in its form today, these are just different marketing terms and different assemblages of the same thing that do exactly what you said, which is push wealth to the elite. So, you have communist Soviet Union, you had a wealthy elite class, democratically elected constitutional republic United States, you had an elite class. You end up with the same partition of people because this is what governments do. So what governments have always had to do, and this is very sadistic, and again, I'm back to sometimes it's incompetence or it's happenstance, so I'm not saying they're all thinking this way. But one thing governments know is that starving people will kill them, right? If you want to see congressmen and senators hang from lampposts, let people starve. Historically, when there's popular uprisings where violent revolution occurs, and it's not just one goon taking over for another, like they literally clean house, it's when people are starving. But the other side of it is if you don't keep them hungry enough, they don't want to work. So like one of the heroes of the economic right is like John Locke. But if you go back and read some of his letters to some of the contemporaries, they had what they called the problem of the serf, which was they had all this industry coming up in rural areas like London and what have you, and they needed workers. They didn't have automation. They needed people to come to the factories and work. And they're like, but the sons of the serf, they kill a couple pigs a year, they harvest some grain, they live in their father's house, they build another house on it, they live there for generations. How do we get them off the farm and to the factory? And so your government doesn't want self-sufficient people because then you don't need them. How do they take liberty from you? They use fear and a belief that you need them. That is how they take liberty from us left and right.
And then so, convenience now, right? I mean, it used to be fear and necessity, but now it's just we're dumb as fuck now, right? It's just being a little bit more convenient than the way we're doing things. We're like, oh, fuck it.
Than dumb, dude.
I mean,
we think we're smart and we're stupid. That's so much worse.
Yeah, it's so much worse.
Educated idiots.
Yeah, people die from starvation, from the cold, from disease, and from foreign armies, typically throughout human history, right?
Yeah.
So security, sanitation, energy, and food. And if you can provide these things for yourself, right, a way to get clean water, which is pretty easy. Like there's some states I think that say you can't legally collect rainwater, but has anybody ever been arrested for that? And what the fuck would that even look like, to be honest?
Yes, but not the way that we would think of it. So there's been places where people have literally defied the government, thrown the nose at them, and they have restrictions on water harvesting. They put in ponds. And they get prosecuted. But a guy with rain barrels or some shit, and we can teach you in the world of permaculture how to harvest water, and no one understands that was what you're doing. We use a technology called a swale, which is a ditch that's perfectly on contour. So you're a military guy, so you look at a contour map, that line, that's that 980 feet above elevation line. Basically, you're putting a ditch in exactly on that line. So the water comes in, and what do we say is the only thing water can do? It can run off. Well, it can't run off. It's in a ditch that's on contour, so it just spreads out. And it can puddle and evaporate or infiltrate. So we hold the water in the land. That's one way to deal with that, right? But you were talking about like what killed people. And what it made me think of was, I can't remember the name of the documentary, but it was right when I discovered like carnivore, keto, all of that. And my wife and I just watched everything we could find out. We found this documentary on Netflix. And what these people did, they went, and it was in Australia, they went and they found all these Aborigines, and they found out all these Aboriginal people had all the modern diseases, diabetes, etc. And they said, what if we put them on their ancestral diet? What would happen? And they only did it for like 3 weeks, and the turnaround in health in these people was unbelievable. And it wasn't all meat, but it was very meat-centric, and it certainly wasn't anything off of a store shelf in a bag. But they asked these two really old, like the oldest two ladies there, very, very overweight, they were probably in their 60s, but they looked like they were in their 80s because life had been hard. And they asked them if they could remember what people used to die of, right? And they said, well, if you go back before antibiotics, people and vaccines, people died of infectious diseases, right? They said, well, before that, what did they die of? And they're like, war, famine. And they kind of look at each other, and both of them kind of like do the whole, yeah, like two dudes kind of going, do you know what it is?
Yeah.
And they say, old age. So if you didn't get stabbed or shot or starved to death somehow, you died of old age. But we came into this world of antibiotics and then vaccines, where it seemed like medicine had saved so many lives. And I'm going to be fair here and say, yes, it did. But then we got to where and it's just like agriculture, same thing, became a solution for everything.
Yeah.
We don't need to vaccinate against everything a human being can be exposed to, right? You know what I mean? Like that doesn't make a lot of sense to me, that we're going to be afraid of a condition like, let's say, chicken pox or what have you. And I wouldn't fault you if you did that for your kids, but I'm also going to say that, you know, I had chicken pox, you probably had chicken pox. We ended up okay, right? Smallpox, like we took something that wiped out millions and tens and maybe hundreds of millions of people, maybe billions across time, and we eradicated it from the planet, and that was good. But like everything else that the state does, it became like, look what we have done for you. Without us, you know, you would die without us. You know, yes, we broke your legs, but aren't you lucky we gave you a wheelchair?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like the state is you're creating a weapon to some degree. And when the state's large, the individual's small. But the bigger, I think the more nefarious part, other than all the ways that it extracts labor, wealth, and liberty from us, is that the megalomaniacs who end up at the top of this particular pyramid sometimes get offended, right? Or sometimes somebody disagrees with them in another country, and they have to marshal all the resources of that country to go fight wars for some fucking reason, right? I mean, there certainly have been some noble causes throughout human history, but what the fuck? I mean, not lately, frankly. Yeah. I haven't seen a war fought lately that meant a goddamn thing to anybody except for the people who were selling the fucking weapons.
The last war, and some people may get upset with me on this, but the last war I feel like that we fought in as a nation that was really justified was World War II. And I also feel...
Oh, that's a fact. I don't know how anybody could argue with that, to be honest.
But we also caused it.
Right?
If our involvement in World War I is directly applicable to what happened in World War II.
Sure.
It was one of the few places where, like, we fucked something up, we took responsibility for it, and we actually did help to fix it. Like, that's the other thing, too. We fuck a lot of shit up and say, oh, we fucked it up, we better fix it. But to me, like 9 times out of 10, every time we think we're fixing something, you know, we kind of make it worse. You know, I served in the Army back from 89 to 93. I was in the first Gulf War. This was something that was very hard for me to accept as a veteran, that maybe we're not always the good guys. You know, the Michelin Web one, are we the baddies? Like, maybe we're the baddies sometimes, that we need to not be sticking our nose in everything. And I guess that's pretty far off of where we started talking about the food supply, but in a way it's not. We fight over resources. Warfare is older than humans. Animals have warfare, and it's always about resources. You want to cut warfare to nothing, make things abundant. I'm sure you know that the word salary comes from the word salt, that Roman legions were paid part of their salary in salt. And a man is only worth his salt or what have you, right? We used to fight wars over salt. There were wars fought over, you know, control of the Silk Road, but it was really pepper. It was like the #1 spice on the Silk Road was pepper. We men spilled blood of other men over salt and fucking pepper because some ruler told them that they had to. As much as we've screwed up, have you ever in your life seen somebody kill somebody over salt?
No, I haven't. But that's a good analog
it's abundant.
That's a good analog for you know, something you said earlier, something I say all the time, which is that if the government shows up to your community and nobody's got their hand out, they have no power there, right? And that should be the goal for anybody that lives in any community, right? And it, like not even just like you are an anarcho-capitalist. I am basically the same. that maybe from your perspective you think that's an extreme position, but you certainly think you can handle your own problems better. If somebody tried to come tell you how to raise your kids, you tell them to go fuck themselves, right?
Correct.
And rightly so. But if they come and tell you how to live your day-to-day life, as long as they provide you either some fear or some convenience for it, you'll just go along with it. Like, no, man. The act of collectively saying no is one of the most powerful things that citizenry can do. And it's really important that we exercise that muscle from time to time, because over the last 3 years, 4 years now, there have been two versions of that with vastly different outcomes. The first one was, oh, it's just 2 weeks, it's just a mask, it's just a shot. And we saw how that fucking worked out. 750 to 900,000 privately owned businesses closed forever. Those are family businesses that will never reopen. About 1 million of them, if you believe the liberal number. Kids lost 3 years of education, basically, right? We're way behind on that now. And then all the other fucking state security bullshit that got put in place. And then there was the other one where everybody said no all at the same time, which is the Governance Disinformation Board, when DHS tried to set up that fucking censorship outfit in DHS. And everybody was like, nah, we're not doing that. Fuck that. No. And within a month or two, that woman was fired and the whole program was shut down. So maybe you feel like you can't do anything. I'm just one person. What can I do? Well, we did that. We did it pretty successfully, right? Because everybody was paying attention. They had been fucked around with enough that they were paying attention now. And all I'm asking you to do is to realize that no matter how comfortable you are or you feel, they're fucking with you, right? Just pay attention to it. And most of the time, that's going to be enough to stop them from doing shit.
Yeah. Yeah. And there was, even during the whole, COVID bullshit, there were places where there were like places you wouldn't even think of where people stood up. There was one place in somewhere on a beach in California, some town that had shut everything down and locked everything out. And all of a sudden the residents just decided, we're going to the fucking beach. And one of the bureaucrats from the town made a statement that I just thought was like, I need to hear this more often in my life to be happy and content as a man. The people of our town have decided they no longer wish to be governed this way. It was a total surrender. It was like, once there's 10,000 people going to the beach that are all telling us to go get fucked, there isn't anything we can do anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, it reminds me of this.
The numbers are on their side. The cop is not going to arrest his brother-in-law who's out there getting a suntan. It's just there's nothing we can do now.
Yeah.
And that is our power, but most people don't realize that they have it. And again, back to the food thing, that's why, imagine a neighborhood where every other person had a couple rabbit hutches and all the other people had a few chickens, and we were growing food for the animals and we were recycling our nutrient, we were trading with each other. And they say, well, we're going to do this thing. How much more likely is that group of people to just turn around and go, get fucked?
Yeah.
Right? Go get fucked. Well, you need us. No, we really don't. And the more you move in that direction, the more that becomes the case. And I think the one good thing about the whole COVID crap is there's about 30% of people in America who said absolutely no to everything. We didn't get the jab. We didn't do shit. We resisted a multi-trillion-dollar, multi-year marketing campaign. If you want to know which side you are on of that debate right now, you now know. And I won't pick on the person who, they were going to lose 18 years of a 20-year retirement or something, and they went ahead and capitulated. I understand the place that people were put into, and they did the absolute minimum they had to do to get through the time that they were in, even though they didn't want to. But there were a lot of people that headlong just did everything they were told. If the government would have said, insert your left thumb up your ass when you go into public to avoid spreading COVID, there would have been people walking around with their thumb in their ass. There were that level of people. And now we know who those people are. And you know if you're one of them or not.
Yeah, and I'm, all the better for it, frankly, to know who's who.
The mask thing, I wish they'd keep wearing masks. Remember, what was his name from the Jeff Foxworthy group? Bill Engvall?
Oh, yeah.
Here's your sign?
Yeah.
Yeah, put your sign on, man. Then I won't, I was wondering if you could tell. Oh, never mind. I didn't see your sign.
Yeah. It's to me, that's the in-person equivalent of somebody having pronouns in their bio on any social media. If I see that, I immediately am like, nope, no, I don't. That's not even a real person, so I'm not talking to you.
Especially at this point in the whole thing too, the little Ukrainian flag. If you have pronouns and a Ukraine flag, And especially if you're a person, if I handed you a globe and told you to tell me where Ukraine was and you can't tell me, I don't disvalue you as a human, but I disvalue you as a source of information or relationship.
Sure,
just,
yeah.
But
Yeah,
yeah, you're done.
you still deserve to live a peaceful
Yeah.
life, sure, but I'm not going to listen to any goddamn thing you say because you're retarded.
No.
You're retarded, basically, right? I mean, let's be fucking real about it. Anyways, we got to get going here, but before we leave, this has been a great conversation. I appreciate you coming on and educating the audience on this stuff, because it does feel like for a lot of people, I get this feedback a lot, that they don't know where to start. Now you've got some ideas on where to start. You've got some ideas on the science that supports it as well. So tell everybody where they can find you and find more information about all this stuff.
Sure. So the main place to find all my stuff is the survivalpodcast.com. We've been doing that show since 2008. We're one of the longest running continuous podcasts on the internet today. We've done over 3,400 episodes. So whether it's money, it's food, it doesn't matter what it is. We've covered it. Alternative energy. You just use our search box, subscribe to the podcast, subscribe to the YouTube channel and all that. And like I said earlier, we've also recently launched a new site called homefoodsystems.com. And there's 2 courses there right now. One is on bioreactor compost, and it's inexpensive. It's $40, and it's like an 8-hour course with certification exams, all of that. I am the instructor for the whole thing, and that will teach you to restore this biology on property. There's also another one called principle-based permaculture design. And if we ever come back, maybe we can dig deep into just the principle-based design. Principles they're agnostic to your climate, where you live, how big your land. Principles are principles. They're independent of those things. And that course is based on David Holdren, who's the co-founder of Permaculture with Bill Mollison's 12 Principles of Permaculture, and Bill Mollison's 3 Ethics and Prime Directive of Permaculture. And it's free. All you got to do is sign up, and you can take that course for free. And it's about a 4-hour intensive course with exams and certification as well. And we just wanted something that people could get kind of a taste of what the education's like. And so I would advise any of your folks out there that want to learn how to produce their own food and design systems. And another thing is, because you hit on this so many times today, pattern recognition. That's a huge part of permaculture. There's so many things you said, it's like this or it's like that. That's because you flipped a switch in your mind where you now see patterns, and it's innately human, but it's been drummed out of us. If you've ever walked out of like a hotel room with 4 switches on the wall and 2 are up and 1 is down, but they're in the wrong sequence, and there's a little piece of you that wanted to fix it, it's not because you're OCD, it's because we see patterns.
Right.
And so once you open up to this pattern, you become very difficult to control. So check out our site, thesurvivalpodcast.com. Check out our educational courses at homefoodsystems.com. And if I can help anybody, just reach out and get in touch with me. My email is jack@thesurvivalpodcast.com, and my little code to actually get to me, put the letters TSPC, like it's a word, TSPC, in the subject line, and that way, no matter where it goes, it eventually I will see it.
Sweet. Well, look, man, thanks for coming today. I appreciate all the information. I'm definitely going to check out that permaculture class that you got going on there, and I recommend all of you do too, just so you understand what it is. And I think the concept of permaculture in general is a really good introduction into how little you need anybody outside of your community to produce the food that you need, frankly. It's probably the best primer on that specific thing. So definitely go check that out. Go check out the Survival Podcast. There's plenty of episodes. And go check out Jack. Thanks again for coming today, man.
Thank you for having me on. And anytime I can be of any help, just let me know. Just reach out and let me know.
Oh, well, thanks, buddy. And thank you all for listening. This has been Citizen.